In this video, we're brewing espresso with the Nietzsche Zero grinder. Welcome, my name is Patrick Rolfe and this is Coffee with April. If you watched our latest video here at the channel, you know that we brewed filter with the Nietzsche Zero grinder. And before you watch this video, we kind of recommend you to go back and watch that video because this is how we brew espresso with that same grinder, right? So a little bit of a shorter video, just some insights, tips and tricks, what we kind of have experience with it and how we chose to kind of define our current favorite recipe. So first of all, we know from last week that this grinder is producing a very high amount of fines and actually quite a wide range of different particle sizes, which when brewing is always a little bit of a challenge. This specifically because it generates a lot more fines than the grinders we normally use brewing espresso with here at April. So we test brewed a bunch of different shots using our April selection line, which is a little bit of a lighter roasted coffee, or quite a lot lighter than what perhaps a lot of people are using when brewing espresso. And bottom line is that using this grinder, we can't really get a shot that we're super happy with. It's a little bit off texture-wise, a little bit too bitter, just not as clean, as transparent as what we're looking for. So we started to play around with our slightly more developed range, our sustainable house coffee, and that comes out tasting a lot better. So just for future reference, we would probably recommend using something not crazy light roasted using this grinder. It just tastes better with something slightly more developed. For those of you that are roasters who have some kind of insight in color or agtron, our SP Costa Rica is around 96 agtron more or less. It's a wash process Caturra and Catuai farm blend. So super kind of balanced, sweet, a lot of chocolatey notes, a lot of nutty notes, and a little bit of kind of yellow plum vibes as well, right? So overall a clean coffee, not crazy developed, but still more developed than our normal April line. Now, brewing espresso, a few things to consider. One, we talked about that last week. They're pitching that it's a zero retention grinder. It's true in the sense that they are providing a very consistent grind result. So the volume that we're putting in, sure, we lose a little bit, but we lose very consistently every single time we dose. So it's actually quite easy to work with. Now, in terms of grind size, as always, that is connected to the dose we're using, and the dose we're using is connected to the basket size, right? So here at April, we're using basically a standard 20 gram competition size basket, and we tend to always down dose 1 gram, so we're at 19 grams. The reason for that here is that we want to give the coffee a little bit of room to expand, to keep that flow rate a little bit more consistent. Espresso machine currently set on a max bar pressure of 6 bar. This is kind of important because if you're using 9 bar or something similar, you're most likely not going to be able to use the reference grind size that we are working with. Now, when it comes to grind size, you know, in terms of filter coffee, we had a little bit of a challenge. And when we can do espresso, it's also a little bit of a challenge. We're simply not within the suggested range, which is perfectly fine. It's actually a lot easier to brew espresso with it because that stays within the kind of acceptable range, so we can use the kind of markings on the grinder to figure out where we want to be. We end up with a grind size of about 26, I guess, so 20 and then 6 clicks further. And that gives us basically the kind of espresso that we are looking for here at April. So we're basically going to just brew an espresso. We're going to taste it. We're going to talk a little bit more, and that's about it. So whenever we grind here, we basically double weigh. So we weigh the dry dose of beans, and we obviously weigh the ground coffee as well to make sure that we're 100% accurate. So grinding for espresso, not the fastest, also not the slowest. We experienced other grinders being a lot slower. What you have to keep in mind here, as a lot of other grinders, you just have to make sure that all of those beans are actually going through the grinder, which can sometimes take a little bit of time, right? So here we basically does 19.1 and we're getting 19.0 out, right? So there's not much, that's like pretty much okay, right? Now, a little bit of a critique and a little bit of a highlight at the same time is that we really like that the dosing cup is created to actually put into the portafilter. Really helpful when we brew espresso. There's two things to consider here. One, the fit kind of goes all the way down to the bottom. So when we take this up, you're gonna have basically an edge around the coffee in the portafilter, which we're not super happy with in terms of distribution and consistency. It basically requires us to do a lot more prep work with the puck, which is a little bit unnecessary. Secondly, you have this kind of rim on the inside of the doser, and we keep on having coffee stuck in here. It's hard to say exactly how much that is, but probably around 0.2 to 0.1 grinder, right? So that zero retention that you get from the actual grinder, you're probably losing just about the same amount of espresso or espresso grind in here than what you use in a normal grinder. So just something to think about. Now, to make the espresso brewing a little bit more fun, and we're not going to talk about in detail about this little tool now, but we're using this little distribution tool here from Brew in South Korea. They do some really interesting stuff, and since we're spending more and more time focusing on espresso, it's kind of a handy tool to use here. One of the things that it does is that it cleans up most of the clumping, and this grinder is clumping a lot, naturally also given the factor that we are actually a bit coarser than what they suggest on espresso. So we assume a lot of people are actually grinding finer, generating even more clumps, which makes this tool make a lot more sense. But again, we're gonna make another video about that in the future, describing that more in detail. At the moment, we're just basically testing it. Now, temp pressure, another thing that we've discussed being really important, and something we're gonna go into more in detail in the future as well. But basically, how hard or how loose your temp is gonna make a big difference on the quality of that espresso. So, time for brewing. We're flushing the group head, as per always. Making sure that everything is clean and tidy. And then we're basically good to go. As always, you want to minimize the amount of time the portafilter sits in the group head until you actually push play. So whenever we brew espresso here, we brew everything a lot quicker than what maybe a lot of people are used to, targeting total brew times around 20 to 25 seconds. So here we're getting 52 grams out on a 19 gram dose in 22 seconds, and that's pretty much our target. Brewing a little bit faster when it comes to espresso, just make that a little bit cleaner, which is something that we really appreciate. Often generates a slightly better balance as well, which is also something that we really enjoy. And if you look very close, you actually see that we have a little bit of crema on the espresso, which is a little bit unusual in our case. But when we brew our kind of house coffee range, that's kind of what comes out. We're gonna take a quick break, have a little bit of a tasting, talk a little bit about it, and then come back with just a little bit of a summary. Thank you. We're back with a little bit of a summary here, right? So, is this grinder able to produce a tasty espresso? Yes. Would we recommend to work with something a little bit more developed in terms of roasting for this grinder? Yes. We just don't believe it's quite capable to brew a little bit more of a modern light roasted espresso. You kind of want to go a little bit more old school, but you can still kind of stretch out the espresso as we did now as well, which we always recommend you to do. These kind of 1-to-2 ratios never really taste good. It's time to really stretch out that espresso a little bit, right? Then faster brew time, always recommended. It becomes a little bit cleaner, a little bit more developed, a little bit better balanced, we think in general, right? When we come to espresso, we really have to think about that mouthfeel. And a big part of that mouthfeel is how well is the coffee rested before you're brewing it, right? So in terms of espresso roast, basically don't touch it until at least 2 weeks. We'll probably say 2.5 to 3 weeks from roast, when most of that CO2 is going to leave. Again, CO2 leaves faster in a darker roasted coffee, so technically you can brew a darker roasted coffee earlier than a lighter roasted coffee, right? But that's something to consider. So overall, we're quite happy with it. When it comes to espresso, the workflow is actually really easy. It's quite great. It's really clean, really simple, quite fast. If you work with 2 scales like this, it's quite efficient. So overall, we think it's fine, right? And combining with the kind of filter evaluation that we did last week, it's a nice grinder. Is it worth the money? Probably depends a little bit what you're looking for. It's clear that this grinder is created or calibrated on a roast degree that is darker than what April is normally using, and we find this to be the case with most kind of grinders being developed. And that's always a little bit of a challenge, right? Because a lighter roasted coffee and a darker roasted coffee breaks differently in the grinder, gets different particle size. We're just looking for a slightly different grind quality when it comes to that lighter roasted coffees. So that is something to consider. However, we know for a fact that a lot of you are using this grinder for espresso, so we would love to hear your opinions, your thoughts. Do you like it? Don't you like it? What is good? What is bad? We heard a lot of people from the last video talking about recalibrations and stuff like that, which, to be fair, if you spend a lot of money on a new grinder, you shouldn't really have to recalibrate it to use it. I think that's a little bit of a waste of our time, right? If we invest our money in something, you want to be able to unbox it and kind of jump on it directly, right? That being said, have you done any modifications or anything like that? That's always really interesting for us to hear about. As always, we're taking this conversation in a little bit more in general, in-depth espresso talk to our Patreon channel, so make sure you sign up for that as well. With that, we want to just thank you for watching and have a good day. We want to give a special thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. It's because of you that we are able to continue to make these videos. And we want you all to feel free to always come with suggestions and ideas on the content that you want to see, because we are doing this for you and because of you. Thank you from all of us here at April.